Now, let's open our imaginations and begin. The Deliverers of Their Country by Edith Nesbit. It all began with Effie's getting something in her eye. It hurt very much indeed, and it felt something like a red-hot spark. Only it seemed to have legs as well, and wings like a fly. Effie rubbed and cried, not real crying, but the kind your eye does all by itself, without your being miserable inside your mind, and then she went to her father to have the thing in her eye taken out. Effie's father was a doctor, so of course he knew how to take things out of eyes. He did it very cleverly with a soft paintbrush dipped in castor oil. When he had gotten the thing out, he said, "This is very curious." Effie had often gotten things in her eye before, and her father had always seemed to think it was natural, rather tiresome and naughty perhaps, but still natural. He had never before thought it curious. Effie stood holding her handkerchief to her eye and said, "I don't believe it's out." People always say this when they have had something in their eyes. "Oh yes, it's out," said the doctor. "Here it is on the brush. This is very interesting." Effie had never heard her father say that about anything she had any share in. She said, "What?" The doctor carried the brush very carefully across the room and held the point of it under his microscope. Then he twisted the brass screws of the microscope and looked through the top with one eye. "Dear me," he said. "Dear, dear me! 4 well-developed limbs, a long caudal appendage, 5 toes unequal in length, almost like one of the Lacertidae, yet there are traces of wings." The creature under his eye wriggled a little in the castor oil, and he went on, "Yes, a bat-like wing. A new specimen undoubtedly. Effie, run round to the professor and ask him to be kind enough to step in for a few minutes." "You might give me 6 pence, Daddy," said Effie, "because I did bring you the new specimen. I took great care of it inside my eye, and my eye does hurt." The doctor was so pleased with the new specimen that he gave Effie a shilling, and presently the professor stopped round. He stayed to lunch, and he and the doctor quarrelled very happily all the afternoon about the name and the family of the thing that had come out of Effie's eye. But at tea time another thing happened. Effie's brother Harry fished something out of his tea, which he thought at first was an earwig. He was just getting ready to drop it on the floor and end its life in the usual way, when it shook itself in the spoon, spread 2 wet wings, and flopped onto the tablecloth. There it sat, stroking itself with its feet and stretching its wings, and Harry said, "Why, it's a tiny newt!" The professor leaned forward before the doctor could say a word. "I'll give you 1/2 crown for it, Harry, my lad," he said, speaking very fast, and then he picked it up carefully in his handkerchief. "It is a new specimen," he said, "and finer than yours, doctor." It was a tiny lizard, about 1/2 an inch long, with scales and wings. So now the doctor and the professor each had a specimen, and they were both very pleased. But before long these specimens began to seem less valuable, for the next morning, when the knife boy was cleaning the doctor's boots, he suddenly dropped the brushes and the boot and the blacking and screamed out that he was burnt. And from inside the boot came crawling a lizard as big as a kitten, with large, shiny wings. "Why," said Effie, "I know what it is. It's a dragon, like the one St. George killed." And Effie was right. That afternoon, Towser was bitten in the garden by a dragon about the size of a rabbit, which he had tried to chase, and the next morning all the papers were full of the wonderful winged lizards that were appearing all over the country. The papers would not call them dragons, because, of course, no one believes in dragons nowadays, and at any rate the papers were not going to be so silly as to believe in fairy stories. At first there were only a few, but in a week or two the country was simply running alive with dragons of all sizes, and in the air you could sometimes see them as thick as a swarm of bees. They all looked alike except as to size. They were green with scales, and they had 4 legs and a long tail and great wings like bats' wings, only the wings were a pale, half-transparent yellow, like the gearboxes on bicycles. They breathed fire and smoke, as all proper dragons must, but still the newspapers went on pretending they were lizards, until the editor of the Standard was picked up and carried away by a very large one, and then the newspaper people had not anyone left to tell them what they ought not to believe. So, when the largest elephant in the zoo was carried off by a dragon, the papers gave up pretending and put "Alarming Plague of Dragons" at the top of the paper. You have no idea how alarming it was, and at the same time how aggravating. The large-sized dragons were terrible, certainly, but when once you had found out that the dragons always went to bed early because they were afraid of the chill night air, you had only to stay indoors all day, and you were pretty safe from the big ones. But the smaller sizes were a perfect nuisance. The ones as big as earwigs got into the soap, and they got in the butter. The ones as big as dogs got in the bath, and the fire and the smoke inside them made them steam like anything when the cold water tap was turned on, so that careless people were often scalded quite severely. The ones that were as large as pigeons would get into work baskets or corner drawers and bite you when you were in a hurry to get a needle or a handkerchief. The ones as big as sheep were easier to avoid because you could see them coming, but when they flew in at the windows and curled up under your eiderdown and you did not find them until you went to bed, it was always a shock. The ones this size did not eat people, only lettuce, but they always scorched the sheets and pillowcases dreadfully. Of course, the county council and the police did everything that could be done. It was no use offering the hand of the princess to anyone who killed a dragon. This way was all very well in olden times when there was only one dragon and one princess, but now there were far more dragons than princesses, although the royal family was a large one. And besides, it would have been a mere waste of princesses to offer rewards for killing dragons, because everybody killed as many dragons as they could, quite out of their own heads and without rewards at all, just to get the nasty things out of the way. The county council undertook to cremate all dragons delivered at their offices between the hours of 10 and 2, and whole wagon loads and cartloads and truckloads of dead dragons could be seen any day of the week, standing in a long line at the street where the county council had their offices. Boys brought barrow loads of dead dragons, and children on their way home from morning school would call in to leave the handful or 2 of little dragons they had brought in their satchels or carried in their knotted pocket handkerchiefs. And yet there seemed to be as many dragons as ever. Then the police stuck up great wood and canvas towers covered with patent glue. When the dragons flew against these towers, they stuck fast, as flies and wasps do on the sticky papers in the kitchen, and when the towers were covered all over with dragons, the police inspector used to set fire to the towers and burn them, dragons and all. And yet there seemed to be more dragons than ever. The shops were full of patent dragon poison and anti-dragon soap and dragon-proof curtains for the windows, and indeed everything that could be done was done. And yet there seemed to be more dragons than ever. It was not very easy to know what would poison a dragon because, you see, they ate such different things. The largest kind ate elephants, as long as there were any, and then went on with horses and cows. Another size ate nothing but lilies of the valley, and a third size ate only prime ministers if they were to be had, and, if not, would feed freely on servants in livery. Another size lived on bricks, and 3 of them ate 2/3 of the South Lambeth Infirmary in one afternoon. But the size Effie was most afraid of was about as big as your dining room, and that size ate little girls and boys. At first, Effie and her brother were quite pleased with the change in their lives. It was so amusing to sit up at night instead of going to sleep, and to play in the garden lighted by electric lamps. And it sounded so funny to hear Mother say, when they were going to bed, "Good night, my darlings. Sleep sound all day, and don't get up too soon. You must not get up before it's quite dark. You wouldn't like the nasty dragons to catch you." But after a time they got very tired of it all. They wanted to see the flowers and trees growing in the fields, and to see the pretty sunshine out of doors and not just through glass windows and patent dragon-proof curtains. And they wanted to play on the grass, which they were not allowed to do in the electric lamp-lighted garden because of the night dew. and they wanted so much to get out, just for once, in the beautiful, bright, dangerous daylight, that they began to try and think of some reason why they ought to go out. Only they didn't like to disobey their mother. But one morning their mother was busy preparing some new dragon poison to lay down in the cellars, and their father was bandaging the hand of the boot boy, which had been scratched by one of the dragons who liked to eat prime ministers when they were to be had, so nobody remembered to say to the children, "Don't get up till it is quite dark." "Go now," said Harry. "It would not be disobedient to go, and I know exactly what we ought to do, but I don't know how we ought to do it." "What ought we to do?" said Effie. "We ought to wake up St. George, of course," said Harry. "He was the only person in this town who knew how to manage dragons. The people in the fairy tales don't count. But St. George is a real person, and he is only asleep, and he is waiting to be waked up. Only nobody believes in St. George now. I heard Father say so." "We do," said Effie. "Of course we do. And don't you see, Eff, that's the very reason why we should wake him. You can't wake people if you don't believe in them, can you?" Effie said no, but where could they find St. George? "We must go and look," said Harry boldly. "You shall wear a dragon-proof frock made of the stuff like the curtains, and I will smear myself all over with the best dragon poison, and—" Effie clapped her hands and skipped with joy and cried, "Oh, Harry, I know where we can find St. George. In St. George's church, of course." Said Harry, wishing he had thought of it for himself. "You have a little sense sometimes for a girl." So the next afternoon, quite early, long before the beams of sunset announced the coming night when everybody would be up and working, the two children got out of bed. Effie wrapped herself in a shawl of dragon-proof muslin. There was no time to make the frock, and Harry made a horrid mess of himself with the patent dragon poison. It was warranted harmless to infants and invalids, so he felt quite safe. Then they joined hands and set out to walk to St. George's Church. As you know, there are many St. George's churches, but fortunately they took the turning that leads to the right one and went along in the bright sunlight, feeling very brave and adventurous. There was no one about in the streets except dragons, and the place was simply swarming with them. Fortunately, none of the dragons were just the right size for eating little boys and girls, or perhaps this story might have had to end here. There were dragons on the pavement and dragons on the roadway, dragons basking on the front doorsteps of public buildings, and dragons preening their wings on the roofs in the hot afternoon sun. The town was quite green with them. Even when the children had gotten out of the town and were walking in the lanes, they noticed that the fields on each side were greener than usual with the scaly legs and tails, and some of the smaller sizes had made themselves asbestos nests in the flowering hawthorn hedges. Effie held her brother's hand very tight, and once when a fat dragon flopped against her ear, she screamed out, and a whole flight of green dragons rose from the field at the sound and sprawled away across the sky. The children could hear the rattle of their wings as they flew. "Oh, I want to go home," said Effie. "Don't be silly," said Harry. "Surely you haven't forgotten about the 7 champions and all the princes. People who are going to be their country's deliverers never scream and say they want to go home." "And are we?" asked Effie. "Deliverers, I mean?" "You'll see," said her brother. And on they went. When they came to St. George's Church, they found the door open, and they walked right in. But St. George was not there, so they walked around the churchyard outside, and presently they found the great stone tomb of St. George, with the figure of him carved in marble outside, in his armor and helmet, and with his hands folded on his breast. "However can we wake him?" they said. Then Harry spoke to St. George, but he would not answer. And he called, but St. George did not seem to hear. And then he actually tried to waken the great dragon slayer by shaking his marble shoulders. But St. George took no notice. Then Effie began to cry, and she put her arms around St. George's neck as well as she could for the marble, which was very much in the way at the back, and she kissed the marble face, and she said, "Oh, dear, good, kind St. George, please wake up and help us." At that, St. George opened his eyes sleepily and stretched himself and said,
What's the matter, little girl?"
So the children told him all about it. He turned over in his marble and leaned on one elbow to listen. But when he heard that there were so many dragons, he shook his head.
"It's no good," he said. "They would be one too many for poor old George. You should have waked me before. I was always for a fair fight. One man, one dragon was my motto."
Just then a flight of dragons passed overhead, and St. George half drew his sword. But he shook his head again and pushed the sword back as the flight of dragons grew small in the distance.
"I can't do anything," he said. "Things have changed since my time. St. Andrew told me about it. They woke him up over the engineer strike, and he came to talk to me. He says everything is done by machinery now. There must be some way of settling these dragons. By the way, what sort of weather have you been having lately?"
This seemed so careless and unkind that Harry would not answer, but Effie said patiently, "It has been very fine. Father says it's the hottest weather there has ever been in this country."
I guessed as much," said the champion thoughtfully. "Well, the only thing would be, dragons can't stand wet and cold. That's the only thing. If you could find the taps."
St. George was beginning to settle down again on his stone slab.
"Good night. Very sorry I can't help you," he said, yawning behind his marble hand.
"Oh, but you can," cried Effie. "Tell us, what taps?"
"Oh, like in the bathroom," said St. George, still more sleepily. "And there's a looking glass, too. Shows you all the world and what's going on in it. St. Denis told me about it. Said it was a very pretty thing. I'm sorry I can't. Oh, good night."
And he fell back into his marble and was fast asleep again in a moment.
"We shall never find the taps," said Harry. "I say, wouldn't it be awful if St. George woke up when there was a dragon near, the size that eats champions?"
Effie pulled off her dragon-proof veil. "We didn't meet any the size of the dining room as we came along," she said. "I dare say we shall be quite safe." So she covered St. George with the veil, and Harry rubbed off as much as he could of the dragon poison onto St. George's armor so as to make everything quite safe for him. "We might hide in the church till it's dark," he said, "and then—" But at that moment a dark shadow fell on them, and then they saw that it was a dragon exactly the size of the dining room at home. So then they knew that all was lost. The dragon swooped down and caught the two children in his claws. He caught Effie by her green silk sash and Harry by the little point at the back of his Eton jacket, and then, spreading his great yellow wings, he rose into the air, rattling like a third-class carriage when the brake is hard on.
"Oh, Harry," said Effie, "I wonder when he will eat us."
The dragon was flying across woods and fields with great flaps of his wings that carried him 1/4 of a mile at each flap. Harry and Effie could see the country below, hedges and rivers and churches and farmhouses flowing away from under them much faster than you see them running away from the sides of the fastest express train. And still the dragon flew on. The children saw other dragons in the air as they went, but the dragon who was as big as the dining room never stopped to speak to any of them, but just flew on quite steadily.
"He knows where he wants to go," said Harry. "Oh, if he would only drop us before he gets there."
But the dragon held on tight, and he flew and flew and flew, until at last, when the children were quite giddy, he settled down, with a rattling of all of his scales, on the top of a mountain. And he lay there on his great green scaly side, panting and very much out of breath because he had come such a long way. But his claws were fast in Effie's sash and the little point on the back of Harry's Eton jacket. Then Effie took out the knife Harry had given her on her birthday, It had cost only 6 pence to begin with, and she had had it a month, and it never could sharpen anything but slate pencils, but somehow she managed to make that knife cut her sash in front and crept out of it, leaving the dragon with only a green silk bow in one of its claws. That knife would never have cut Harry's jacket tail off, though, and when Effie had tried for some time, she saw that this was so and gave it up. But with her help, Harry managed to wriggle quietly out of his sleeves, so the dragon had only an eaten jacket in his other claw. Then the children crept on tiptoe to a crack in the rocks and got in. It was much too narrow for the dragon to get in also, so they stayed in there and waited to make faces at the dragon when he felt rested enough to sit up and begin to think about eating them. He was very angry indeed when they made faces at him and blew out fire and smoke at them, but they ran further into the cave so that he could not reach them, and when he was tired of blowing, he went away. But they were afraid to come out of the cave, so they went further in, and presently the cave opened out and grew bigger, and the floor was soft sand, and when they had come to the very end of the cave there was a door, and on it was written, "Universal Tap Room. Private. No one allowed inside." So they opened the door at once just to peep in, and then they remembered what St. George had said. "We can't be worse off than we are," said Harry, "with a dragon waiting for us outside. Let's go in." They went boldly into the tap room and shut the door behind them. And now they were in a sort of room cut out of the solid rock, and all along one side of the room were taps, and all the taps were labeled with china labels like you see in baths. And as they could both read words of 2 syllables, or even 3 sometimes, they understood at once that they had gotten to the place where the weather is turned on from. There were 6 big taps labeled sunshine, wind, rain, snow, hail, ice, and a lot of little ones labeled fair to moderate, showery, south breeze, nice growing weather for the crops, skating, good open weather, south wind, east wind, and so on. And the big tap labeled sunshine was turned full on. They could not see any sunshine. The cave was lighted by a skylight of blue glass, so they supposed the sunshine was pouring out by some other way, as it does with the tap that washes out the underneath parts of patent sinks in kitchens. Then they saw that one side of the room was just a big looking-glass, and when you looked in it you could see everything that was going on in the world, and all at once, too, which is not like most looking-glasses. They saw the carts delivering dead dragons at the county council offices, and they saw St. George asleep under the dragon-proof veil, and they saw their mother at home crying because her children had gone out in the dreadful, dangerous daylight, and she was afraid a dragon had eaten them. And they saw the whole of England like a great puzzle map, green in the field parts and brown in the towns and black in the places where they make coal and crockery and cutlery and chemicals. And all over it, on the black parts and on the brown and on the green, there was a network of green dragons, and they could see that it was still broad daylight and no dragons had gone to bed yet. Effie said, "Dragons do not like cold." And she tried to turn off the sunshine, but the tap was out of order, and that was why there had been so much hot weather, and why the dragons had been able to be hatched. So they left the sunshine alone, and they turned on the snow, and left the tap full on while they went to look in the glass. There they saw the dragons running all sorts of ways, like ants if you're cruel enough to put water into an ant heap, which of course you never are. And the snow fell more and more. And then Effie turned the rain tap quite full on, and presently the dragons began to wriggle less, and by some of them lay quite still, so the children knew the water had put out the fires inside them, and they were dead. So then they turned on the hail, only half on, for fear of breaking people's windows, and after a while there were no more dragons to be seen moving. Then the children knew that they were indeed the deliverers of their country.
"They will put up a monument to us," said Harry, "as high as Nelson's. All the dragons are dead."
"I hope the one that was waiting outside for us is dead," said Effie. "And about that monument, Harry, I'm not so sure. What can they do with such a lot of dead dragons? It would take years and years to bury them, and they could never be burnt now they're so soaking wet. I wish the rain would wash them off into the sea." But this did not happen, and the children began to feel they had not been so frightfully clever after all.
"I wonder what this old thing's for," said Harry.
He had found a rusty old tap, which seemed as though it had not been used for ages. Its china label was quite coated over with dirt and cobwebs. When Effie had cleaned it with a little bit of her skirt, for, curiously enough, both of the children had come out without pocket handkerchiefs, she found that the label said, "Waste." "Let's turn it on," she said. "It might carry off the dragons." The tap was very stiff from not having been used for such a long time, but together they managed to turn it on and then ran to the mirror to see what happened. Already a great round black hole had opened up in the very middle of the map of England, and the sides of the map were tilting themselves up so that the rain fell downwards toward the hole. "Oh, hurrah, hurrah, hurrah!" cried Effie, and she hurried back to the taps and turned on everything that seemed wet. Showery, good open weather, nice growing weather for the crops, and even south and southwest because she'd heard her father say that those winds brought rain. And now the floods of rain were pouring down on the country, and great sheets of water flowed toward the center of the map, and cataracts of water poured into the great round hole in the middle of the map, and the dragons were being washed away and disappearing down the waste pipe in great green masses and scattered green shoals, single dragons and dragons by the dozen of all sizes, from the ones that carry off elephants down to the ones that get in your tea. Presently there was not a dragon left. So then they turned off the tap named Waste, and they half turned off the one labeled Sunshine. It was broken, so they could not turn it off altogether, and they turned on Fair to Moderate and Showery, and both taps stuck, so they could not be turned at all, which accounts for our climate. How did they get home again? By the Snowdon Railway, of course. And was the nation grateful? Well, the nation was very wet. And by the time the nation had gotten dry again, it was interested in the new invention for toasting muffins by electricity, and all the dragons were almost forgotten. Dragons do not seem so important when they are dead and gone, and you know there never was a reward offered. And what did Father and Mother say when Effie and Harry got home? My dear, that is just the sort of silly question you children always will ask. However, just for this once, I don't mind telling you. Mother said, "Oh, my darlings, you're safe, you're safe. You naughty children, how could you be so disobedient? Go to bed at once." And their father, the doctor, said, "I wish I had known what you were going to do. I should have liked to preserve a specimen. I threw away the one I got out of Effie's eye. I intended to get a more perfect specimen. I did not anticipate this immediate extinction of the species." The professor said nothing, but he rubbed his hands. He had kept his specimen, the one the size of an earwig that he gave Harry half a crown for, and he has it to this day. You must get him to show it to you. The Island of the Nine Whirlpools by E. Nesbit. The dark arch that led to the witch's cave was hung with a black and yellow fringe of live snakes. As the queen went in, keeping carefully in the middle of the arch, all the snakes lifted their wicked flat heads and stared at her with their wicked yellow eyes. You know it is not good manners to stare, even at royalty, except of course for cats. And the snakes had been so badly brought up that they even put their tongues out at the poor lady. Nasty, thin, sharp tongues they were, too. Now the queen's husband was, of course, the king, and besides being a king, he was an enchanter and considered to be quite at the top of his profession, so he was very wise, and he knew that when kings and queens want children, the queen always goes to see a witch. So he gave the queen the witch's address, and the queen called on her, though she was very frightened and didn't like it at all. The witch was sitting by a fire of sticks, stirring something bubbly in a shiny copper cauldron.
"What do you want, my dear?"
she said to the queen. "Oh, if you please," said the queen, "I want a baby, a very nice one. We don't want any expense spared. My husband said—"
"Oh, yes," said the witch. "I know all about him. And so, you want a child. Do you know it will bring you sorrow?"
"It will bring me joy first," said the queen.
"Great sorrow," said the witch.
"Greater joy," said the queen.
Then the witch said, "Well, have your own way. I suppose it's as much as your place is worth to go back without it?"
"The king would be very much annoyed," said the poor queen.
"Well, well," said the witch. "What will you give me for the child?"
"Anything you ask for, and all that I have," said the queen.
"Then give me your gold crown."
The queen took it off quickly.
"And your necklace of blue sapphires."
The queen unfastened it.
"And your pearl bracelets."
The queen unclasped them.
"And your ruby clasps."
The queen undid the clasps.
"Now the lilies from your breast."
The queen gathered together the lilies.
"And the diamonds of your little bright shoe buckles."
The queen pulled off her shoes. Then the witch stirred the stuff that was in the cauldron, and, one by one, she threw in the gold crown and the sapphire necklace and the pearl bracelets and the ruby clasps and the diamonds of the little bright shoe buckles, and last of all she threw in the lilies. The stuff in the cauldron boiled up in foaming flashes of yellow and blue and red and white and silver, and sent out a sweet scent, and presently the witch poured it out into a pot and set it to cool in the doorway among the snakes. Then she said to the queen, "Your child will have hair as golden as your crown, eyes as blue as your sapphires. The red of your rubies will lie on its lips, and its skin will be clear and pale as your pearls. Its soul will be white and sweet as your lilies, and your diamonds will be no clearer than its wits." "Oh, thank you, said the queen. "And when will it come?"
"You will find it when you get home."
"And won't you have something for yourself?" asked the queen. "Any little thing you fancy? Would you like a country or a sack of jewels?"
"Nothing, thank you," said the witch. "I could make more diamonds in a day than I should wear in a year."
"Well, but do let me do some little thing for you," the queen went on. "Aren't you tired of being a witch? Wouldn't you like to be a duchess or a princess or something like that?"
"There is one thing I should rather like," said the witch, "but it's hard to get in my trade."
"Oh, tell me what," said the queen.
"I should like someone to love me," said the witch.
Then the queen threw her arms around the witch's neck and kissed her 100 times. "Why," she said, "I love you better than my life. You've given me the baby, and the baby shall love you too."
"Perhaps it will," said the witch. "And when the sorrow comes, send for me. Each of your 50 kisses will be a spell to bring me to you. Now, drink up your medicine, there's a dear, and run along home."
So the queen drank all the stuff in the pot, which was quite cool by this time, and she went out under the fringe of snakes, and they all behaved like good Sunday school children. Some of them even tried to drop a curtsy to her as she went by, though that is not easy when you are hanging wrong way up by your tail. But the snakes knew the queen was friends with their mistress, and so of course they had to do their best to be civil. When the queen got home, sure enough, there was the baby lying in the cradle with the royal arms blazoned on it, crying as naturally as possible. It had pink ribbons to tie up its sleeves, so the queen saw at once it was a girl. When the king knew this, he tore his black hair with fury. "Oh, you silly, silly queen," he said. "Why didn't I marry a clever lady? Do you think I went to all the trouble and expense of sending you to a witch to get a girl? You knew well enough it was a boy I wanted, a boy, an heir, a prince,
to learn all my magic and my enchantments, and to rule the kingdom after me. I'll bet a crown, my crown," he said. "You never even thought to tell the witch what kind you wanted, did you now?" And the queen hung her head and had to confess that she had only asked for a child. "Very well, madam," said the king. "Very well. Have your own way, and make the most of your daughter while she is a child." The queen did. All the years of her life had never held half so much happiness as now lived in each of the moments when she held her little baby in her arms. And the years went on, and the king grew more and more clever at magic, and more disagreeable at home, and the princess grew more beautiful and more dear every day she lived. The queen and the princess were feeding the goldfish in the courtyard fountains with crumbs of the princess's 18th birthday cake when the king came into the courtyard looking as black as thunder, with his black raven hopping after him. He shook his fist at his family, as indeed he generally did whenever he met them, for he was not a king with pretty home manners. The raven sat down on the edge of the marble basin and tried to peck the goldfish. It was all he could do to show that he was in the same temper as his master. "A girl indeed," said the king angrily. "I wonder you can dare to look me in the face when you remember how your silliness has spoiled everything." "You oughtn't to speak to my mother like that," said the princess. She was 18, and it came to her suddenly and all in a moment that she was a grown-up, so she spoke out. The king could not utter a word for several minutes. He was too angry. But the queen said, "My dear child, don't interfere," quite crossly, for she was frightened. And to her husband she said, "My dear, why do you go on worrying about it? Our daughter is not a boy, it's true, but she may marry a clever man who could rule your kingdom after you, and learn as much magic as ever you cared to teach him." Then the king found his tongue. "If she does marry," he said slowly, "her husband will have to be a very clever man. Oh, yes, very clever indeed. And he will have to know a very great deal more magic than I shall ever care to teach him." The queen knew at once by the king's tone that he was going to be disagreeable. "Oh," she said, "don't punish the child because she loves her mother." "I'm not going to punish her for that," said he. "I'm only going to teach her to respect her father." And without another word he went off to his laboratory and worked all night, boiling different colored things in crucibles and copying charms in curious twisted letters from old brown books with mold stains on their yellowy pages. The next day his plan was all arranged. He took the poor princess to the lone tower which stands on an island in the sea 1,000 miles from anywhere. He gave her a dowry and settled a handsome income on her. He engaged a competent dragon to look after her, and also a respectable griffin whose birth and upbringing he knew all about. And he said, "Here you shall stay, my dear respectful daughter, till the clever man comes to marry you. He'll have to be clever enough to sail a ship through the 9 whirlpools that spin around the island, and to kill the dragon and the griffin. Till he comes, you'll never get any older or any wiser. No doubt he will soon come. You can employ yourself in embroidering your wedding gown. I wish you joy, my dutiful child." And his carriage, drawn by live thunderbolts — thunder travels very fast — rose in the air and disappeared, and the poor princess was left with the dragon and the griffin on the island of the 9 whirlpools. The queen, left at home, cried for a day and a night, and then she remembered the witch and called to her. And the witch came, and the queen told her all. "For the sake of the 25 kisses you gave me," said the witch, "I will help you. But it is the last thing I can do, and it is not much. Your daughter is under a spell, and I can take you to her. But if I do, you will have to be turned to a stone, and so stay till the spell is taken off the child." "I would be a stone for 1,000 years," said the poor queen, "if at the end of them I could see my dear again." So the witch took the queen in a carriage drawn by sunbeams, which travel more quickly than anything else in the world and much quicker than thunder, and so away and away to the lone tower on the island of the Nine Whirlpools. And there was the princess sitting on the floor in the best room of the lone tower, crying as if her heart would break, and the dragon and the griffin were sitting primly on each side of her. "Oh, mother, mother!" she cried, and hung around the queen's neck as if she would never let go. "Now," said the witch, when they had all cried as much as was good for them, "I can do one or two other little things for you. Time shall not make the princess sad. All days will be like one day till her deliverer comes. And you and I, dear queen, will sit in stone at the gate of the tower. In doing this for you, I lose all my witch's powers, and when I say the spell that changes you to stone, I shall change with you, and if ever we come out of the stone, I shall be a witch no more, but only a happy old woman." Then the three kissed one another again and again, and the witch said the spell, and on each side of the door there was now a stone lady. One of them had a stone crown on its head and a stone scepter in its hand. The other held a stone tablet with words on it, which the griffin and the dragon could not read, although they both had a very good education. And now, all days seemed like one day to the princess, and the next day always seemed the day when her mother would come out of the stone and kiss her again. And the years went slowly by. The wicked king died, and someone else took his kingdom, and many things were changed in the world, but the island did not change, nor the 9 whirlpools, nor the griffin, nor the dragon, nor the 2 stone ladies. And all the time, from the very first, the day of the princess's deliverance was coming, creeping nearer and nearer and nearer. But no one saw it coming except the princess, and she only in dreams. And the years went by in tens and in hundreds, and still the 9 whirlpools spun around, roaring in triumph the story of many a good ship that had gone down in their swirl, bearing with it some prince who had tried to win the princess and her dowry. And the great sea knew all the other stories of the princes who had come from very far and seen the whirlpools, and had shaken their wise young heads and said, "'Bout ship," and gone discreetly home to their nice, safe, comfortable kingdoms. But no one told the story of the deliverer who was to come. And the years went by. Now, after more scores of years than you would like to add up in your slate, a certain sailor boy sailed on the high seas with his uncle, who was a skilled skipper. And the boy could reef a sail and coil a rope and keep the ship's nose steady before the wind. And he was as good a boy as you would find in a month of Sundays, and worthy to be a prince. Now, there is something which is wiser than all the world, and it knows when people are worthy to be princes. And this something came from the farther side of the 7th world, and whispered in the boy's ear. And the boy heard, though he did not know he heard, and he looked out over the black sea with the white foam horses galloping over it, and far away he saw a light. And he said to the skipper, his uncle, "What light is that?" Then the skipper said, "All good things defend you, Nigel, from sailing near that light. It is not mentioned in all the charts, but it is marked in the old chart I steer by, which was my father's father before me, and his father's father before him. It is the light that shines from the lone tower that stands above the 9 whirlpools. And when my father's father was young, he heard from the very old man, his great-great-grandfather, that in that tower an enchanted princess, fairer than the day, waits to be delivered. But there is no deliverance, so never steer that way, and think no more of the princess, for that is only an idle tale, but the whirlpools are quite real." So of course from that day Nigel thought of nothing else, and as he sailed hither and thither upon the high seas, he saw from time to time the light that shone out to sea across the wild swirl of the 9 whirlpools. And one night, when the ship was at anchor and the skipper asleep in his bunk, Nigel launched the ship's boat and steered alone over the dark sea toward the light. He dared not go very near till daylight should show him what, indeed, were the whirlpools he had to dread. When the dawn came, he saw the lone tower standing dark against the pink and primrose of the east, and about its base the sullen swirl of black water, and he heard the wonderful roar of it. So he hung off and on, all that day and for 6 days beside. And when he had watched 7 days, he knew something. For you are certain to know something if you give for 7 days your whole thought to it, even though it be only the first declension, or the 9 times table, or the dates of the Norman kings. And what he knew was this, that for 5 minutes out of the 1,440 minutes that make up a day, the whirlpools slipped into silence while the tide went down and left the yellow sand bare. And every day this happened, but every day it was 5 minutes earlier than it had been the day before. He made sure of this by the ship's chronometer, which he had thoughtfully brought with him. So, on the 8th day, at 5 minutes before noon, Nigel got ready, and when the whirlpool suddenly stopped whirling and the tide sank like water in a basin that has a hole in it, he stuck to his oars and put his back into the stroke and presently beached the boat on the yellow sand. Then he dragged it into a cave and sat down to wait. By 5 minutes and 1 second past noon, the whirlpools were black and busy again, and Nigel peeped out of his cave. And on the rocky ledge overhanging the sea, he saw a princess as beautiful as the day, with golden hair and a green gown, and he went out to meet her. "I've come to save you," he said. "How darling and beautiful you are." "You are very good and very clever and very dear," said the princess, smiling and giving him both her hands. He shut a little kiss in each hand before he let them go. "So now, when the tide is low again, I will take you away in my boat," he said. "But what about the dragon and the griffin?" asked the princess. "Dear me," said Nigel. "I didn't know about them. I suppose I can kill them?" "Don't be a silly boy," said the princess, pretending to be very grown up, for, though she had been on the island for time only knows how many years, she was just 18, and she still liked pretending. "You haven't a sword or a shield or anything." "Well, don't the beasts ever go to sleep?" "Why, yes," said the princess, "but only once in 24 hours, and then the dragon is turned to stone, but the griffin has dreams. The griffin sleeps at tea time every day, but the dragon sleeps every day for 5 minutes, and every day it is 3 minutes later than it was the day before." "What time does he sleep today?" asked Nigel. "At 11, said the princess. "Ah," said Nigel. "Can you do sums?" "No," said the princess sadly. "I was never good at them." "Then I must," said Nigel. "I can, but it's slow work and it makes me very unhappy. It'll take me days and days." "Don't begin yet," said the princess. "You'll have plenty of time to be unhappy when I'm not with you. Tell me all about yourself." So he did, and then she told him all about herself. "I know I've been here a very long time," she said, "but I don't know what time is, and I'm very busy sewing silk flowers on a golden gown for my wedding day. And the griffin does the housework, his wings are so convenient and feathery for sweeping and dusting, and the dragon does the cooking. He's hot inside, of course, so it's no trouble for him. And though I don't know what time is, I'm sure it's time for my wedding day, because my golden gown only wants one more white daisy on the sleeve and a lily on the bosom of it, and then it will be ready." Just then they heard a dry, rustling clatter on the rocks above them and a snorting sound. "It's the dragon," said the princess hurriedly. "Goodbye. Be a good boy and get your sum done." And she ran away and left him to his arithmetic. Now, the sum was this. If the whirlpools stop and the tide goes down once in every 24 hours, and they do it 5 minutes earlier every 24 hours, and if the dragon sleeps every day and he does it 3 minutes later every day, in how many days and at what time in the day will the tide go down 3 minutes before the dragon falls asleep? It is quite a simple sum, as you see. You could do it in a minute because you've been to a good school and have taken pains with your lessons, but it was quite otherwise with poor Nigel. He sat down to work out the sum with a piece of chalk on a smooth stone. He tried it by practice and the unitary method, by multiplication and by rule of 3 3/4. He tried it by decimals and by compound interest. He tried it by square root and by cube root. He tried it by addition, simple and otherwise, and he tried it by mixed examples and vulgar fractions, but it was all no use. Then he tried to do the sum by algebra, by simple and quadratic equations, by trigonometry, by logarithm, and by conic sections, but it would not do. He got an answer every time, it is true, but it was always a different one, and he couldn't feel sure which answer was right. And just as he was feeling how much more important than anything else it is to be able to do your sums, the princess came back. And now it was getting dark. "Why, you've been 7 hours over that sum," she said, "and you haven't done it yet. Look here, this is what is written on the tablet of the statue by the lower gate. It has figures on it. Perhaps it is the answer to the sum." She held out to him a big white magnolia leaf, and she had scratched on it with the pin of her pearl brooch, and it had turned brown where she had scratched it, as magnolia leaves will do. Nigel read, "After 9 days. TII 24. DII 27 ants. PS. And the griffin is artificial. R." He clapped his hands softly. "Dear princess," he said, "I know that's the right answer. It says R too, you see, but I'll just prove it." So he hastily worked the sum backward in decimals and equations and conic sections and all the rules he could think of, and it came right every time. "So now we must wait," said he. And they waited. And every day the princess came to see Nigel and brought him food cooked by the dragon, and he lived in his cave and talked to her when she was there and thought about her when she was not, and they were both as happy as the longest day in summer. Then at last came the day. Nigel and the princess laid their plans. "You're sure he won't hurt you, my only treasure?" said Nigel. "Quite," said the princess. "I only wish I were half as sure that he wouldn't hurt you." "My princess," he said tenderly, "2 great powers are on our side, the power of love and the power of arithmetic. Those 2 are stronger than anything else in the world." So, when the tide began to go down, Nigel and the princess ran out on the sands, and there, in full sight of the terrace where the dragon kept watch, Nigel took his princess in his arms and kissed her. The griffin was busy sweeping the stairs of the lone tower, but the dragon saw, and he gave a cry of rage, and it was like 20 engines all letting off steam at the top of their voices inside Cannon Street Station. And the 2 lovers stood looking up at the dragon. He was dreadful to look at. His head was white with age, and his beard had grown so long that he caught in his claws as he walked. His wings were white with the salt that had settled on them from the spray of the sea. His tail was long and thick and jointed and white, and had little legs to it, any number of them, far too many, so it looked like a very large fat silkworm, and his claws were as long as lessons and as sharp as bayonets. "Goodbye, love!" cried Nigel, and he ran out across the yellow sand toward the sea. He had one end of a cord tied to his arm. The dragon was clambering down the face of the cliff, and next moment he was crawling and writhing and sprawling and wriggling across the beach after Nigel, making great holes in the sand with his heavy feet, and the very end of his tail, where there were no legs, made, as it dragged, a mark in the sand such as you make when you launch a boat. And he breathed fire till the wet sand hissed again, and the water of the little rock pools got quite frightened and all went off in steam. Still, Nigel held on, and the dragon after him. The princess could see nothing for the steam, and she stood crying bitterly, but still holding on tight with her right hand to the other end of the cord that Nigel had told her to hold, while with her left she held the ship's chronometer and looked at it through her tears as he had bidden her to look, so as to know when to pull the rope. On went Nigel over the sand, and on went the dragon after him, and the tide was low, and sleepy little waves lapped at the sand's edge. Now at the lip of the water, Nigel paused and looked back, and the dragon made a bound, beginning a scream of rage that was like all the engines of all the railways in England. But it never uttered the second half of that scream, for now it knew suddenly that it was sleepy. It turned to hurry back to dry land, because sleeping near whirlpools is so unsafe. But before it reached the shore, sleep caught it and turned it to stone. Nigel, seeing this, ran shoreward for his life, and the tide began to flow in, and the time of the whirlpool sleep was nearly over, and he stumbled, and he waded, and he swam, and the princess pulled for dear life at the cord in her hand, and pulled him up onto the dry shelf of rock, just as the great sea dashed in and made itself once more into the girdle of 9 whirlpools all around the island. But the dragon was asleep under the whirlpools, and when he woke up from being asleep, he found he was drowned, so there was an end of him. "Now there's only the griffin," said Nigel. And the princess said, "Yes, only." And she kissed Nigel and went back to sew the last leaf of the last lily on the bosom of her wedding gown. She thought and thought of what was written on the stone about the griffin being artificial, and the next day she said to Nigel, "You know, a griffin is half a lion and half an eagle, and the other 2 halves when they're joined make the leogriff, but I've never seen him. Yet I have an idea." So they talked it over and arranged everything. When the griffin fell asleep that afternoon at tea time, Nigel went softly behind him and trod on his tail, and at the same time the princess cried, "Look out! There's a lion behind you!" And the griffin, waking suddenly from his dreams, twisted his large neck around to look for the lion, and saw a lion's flank and fastened his eagle beak in it. For the griffin had been artificially made by the king enchanter, and the 2 halves had never really got used to each other. So now the eagle half of the griffin, who was still rather sleepy, believed that it was fighting a lion, and the lion part, being half asleep, thought it was fighting an eagle, and the whole griffin, in its deep drowsiness, hadn't the sense to pull itself together and remember what it was made of. So the griffin rolled over and over, one end of it fighting with the other, till the eagle end pecked the lion end to death, and the lion end tore the eagle end with its claws until it died. And so the griffin that was made of a lion and an eagle perished, exactly as if it had been made of Kilkenny cats. "Poor griffin," said the princess. "It was very good at the housework. I always liked it better than the dragon. It wasn't so hot-tempered." At that moment there was a soft, silky rush behind the princess, and there was her mother, the queen, who had slipped out of the stone statue the moment the griffin was dead, and now came hurrying to take her dear daughter in her arms. The witch was clambering slowly off her pedestal. She was a little stiff from standing still so long. When they had all explained everything over and over to each other as many times as was good for them, the witch said, "Well, but what about the whirlpools?" And Nigel said he didn't know. Then the witch said, "I'm not a witch any more. I'm only a happy old woman, but I know some things still. Those whirlpools were made by the enchanter king's dropping 9 drops of his blood into the sea, and his blood was so wicked that the sea has been trying ever since to get rid of it, and that made the whirlpools. Now you've only got to go out at low tide." So Nigel understood, and went out at low tide, and found in the sandy hollow left by the first whirlpool a great red ruby. That was the first drop of the wicked king's blood. The next day Nigel found another, the next day another, and so on till the 9th day, and then the sea was as smooth as glass. The 9 rubies were used afterwards in agriculture. You had only to throw them out into a field if you wanted it plowed. Then the whole surface of the land turned itself over in its anxiety to get rid of something so wicked, and in the morning the field was found to be plowed as thoroughly as any young man at Oxford. So the wicked king did some good after all. When the sea was smooth, ships came from far and wide, bringing people to hear the wonderful story, and a beautiful palace was built, and the princess was married to Nigel in her gold dress, and they all lived happily as long as was good for them. The dragon still lies, a stone dragon in the sand, and at low tide the little children play around him and over him. But the pieces that were left of the griffin were buried under the herb bed in the palace garden because it had been so good at housework, and it wasn't its fault that it had been made so badly and put to such poor work as guarding a lady from her lover. I have no doubt that you will wish to know what the princess lived on during the long years when the dragon did the cooking. My dear, she lived on her income, and that is a thing that a great many people would like to be able to do.
The Dragon Tamers by E. Nesbit. There was once an old, old castle. It was so old that its walls and towers and turrets and gateways and arches had crumbled to ruins, and of all its old splendor there were only 2 little rooms left. And it was here that John the blacksmith had set up his forge. He was too poor to live in a proper house, and no one asked any rent for the rooms in the ruin, because all the lords of the castle were dead and gone this many a year. So there John blew his bellows and hammered his iron and did all the work which came his way. This was not much, because most of the trade went to the mayor of the town, who was also a blacksmith in quite a large way of business, and had his huge forge facing the square of the town, and had 12 apprentices, all hammering like a nest of woodpeckers, and 12 journeymen to order the apprentices about, and a patent forge, and a self-acting hammer, and electric bellows, and all things handsome about him. So of course the townspeople, whenever they wanted a horse shod or a shaft mended, went to the mayor. John the blacksmith struggled on as best he could, with a few odd jobs from travelers and strangers who did not know what a superior forge the mayor's was. The 2 rooms were warm and weather-tight, but not very large, so the blacksmith got into the way of keeping his old iron, his odds and ends, his sticks, and his 2 worth of coal in the great dungeon down under the castle. It was a very fine dungeon indeed, with a handsome vaulted roof and big iron rings whose staples were built into the wall, very strong and convenient for tying captives to, and at one end was a broken flight of wide steps leading down, no one knew where. Even the lords of the castle in the good old times had never known where those steps led to, but every now and then they would kick a prisoner down the steps in their light-hearted, hopeful way, and sure enough, the prisoners never came back. The blacksmith had never dared to go beyond the 7th step, and no more have I, so I know no more than he did what was at the bottom of those stairs. John the blacksmith had a wife and a little baby. When his wife was not doing the housework, she used to nurse the baby and cry, remembering the happy days when she lived with her father, who kept 17 cows and lived quite in the country, and when John used to come courting her in the summer evenings as smart, with a posy in his buttonhole. And now John's hair was getting gray, and there was hardly ever enough to eat. As for the baby, it cried a good deal at odd times, but at night, when its mother had settled down to sleep, it would always begin to cry, quite as a matter of course, so that she hardly got any rest at all. This made her very tired. The baby could make up for its bad nights during the day if it liked, but the poor mother couldn't. So whenever she had nothing to do, she used to sit and cry because she was tired out with work and worry. One evening the blacksmith was busy with his forge. He was making a goat shoe for the goat of a very rich lady who wished to see how the goat liked being shod, and also whether the shoe would come to 5 or 7 before she ordered the whole set. This was the only order John had had that week. And as he worked, his wife sat and nursed the baby, who, for a wonder, was not crying. Presently, over the noise of the bellows and over the clink of the iron, there came another sound. The blacksmith and his wife looked at each other. "I heard nothing," said he. "Neither did I," said she. But the noise grew louder, and the 2 were so anxious not to hear it that he hammered away at the goat shoe harder than he had ever hammered in his life, and she began to sing to the baby, a thing she had not had the heart to do for weeks.
but through the blowing and the hammering and the singing, the noise came louder and louder, and the more they tried not to hear it, the more they had to. It was like the noise of some great creature purring, 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 and the reason they did not want to believe they really heard it was that it came from the great dungeon down below, where the old iron was, and the firewood, and the 2 pence worth of coal, and the broken steps that went down into the dark and ended no one knew where.
It can't be anything in the dungeon," said the blacksmith, wiping his face. "Why, I shall have to go down there after more coals in a minute."
"There isn't anything there, of course. How could there be?" said his wife. And they tried so hard to believe that there could be nothing there that presently they very nearly did believe it. Then the blacksmith took his shovel in one hand and his riveting hammer in the other, and hung the old stable lantern on his little finger, and went down to get the coals.
"I'm not taking the hammer because I think there's something there," said he, "but it is handy for breaking the large lumps of coal."
"I quite understand," said his wife, who had brought the coal home in her apron that very afternoon, and knew that it was all coal dust. So he went down the winding stairs to the dungeon and stood at the bottom of the steps, holding the lantern above his head, just to see that the dungeon really was empty as usual. Half of it was empty as usual, except for the old iron and odds and ends and the firewood and the coals. But the other side was not empty. It was quite full, and what it was full of was dragon. "It must have come up those nasty broken steps from goodness knows where," said the blacksmith to himself, trembling all over as he tried to creep back up the winding stairs. But the dragon was too quick for him. It put out a great claw and caught him by the leg, and as it moved it rattled like a great bunch of keys, or like the sheet iron they make thunder out of in pantomimes.
"No, you don't," said the dragon in a spluttering voice like a damp squib.
"Dearie, dearie me," said poor John, trembling more than ever in the claw of the dragon.
"Here's a nice end for a respectable blacksmith."
The dragon seemed very much struck by this remark. "Do you mind saying that again?" said he, quite politely. So John said again, very distinctly, "Here is a nice end for a respectable blacksmith." "I didn't know," said the dragon. "Fancy now, you're the very man I wanted." "So I understood you to say before," said John, his teeth chattering. "Oh, I don't mean what you mean," said the dragon. "But I should like you to do a job for me. One of my wings has got some of the rivets out of it just above the joint. Could you put that to rights?"
I might, sir," said John politely, for you must always be polite to a possible customer, even if he be a dragon. "A master craftsman, you are a master, of course, can see in a minute what's wrong," the dragon went on. "Just come around here and feel my plates, will you?"
John timidly went around when the dragon took his claw away, and sure enough the dragon's wing was hanging loose, and several of the plates near the joint certainly wanted riveting. The dragon seemed to be made almost entirely of iron armor, a sort of tawny rust-red color it was, from damp, no doubt, and under it he seemed to be covered with something furry. All the blacksmith welled up in John's heart, and he felt more at ease.
"You could certainly do with a rivet or two," said he. "In fact, you want a good many."
"Well, get to work then," said the dragon. "You mend my wing, and then I'll go and eat up all the town, and if you make a really smart job of it, I'll eat you last. There."
"I don't want to be eaten last, sir," said John.
"Well then, I'll eat you first," said the dragon.
"I don't want that either, sir," said John.
"Go on with you, you silly man," said the dragon. "You don't know your own silly mind.
Come, set to work."
"I don't like the job, sir," said John, "and that's the truth. I know how easily accidents happen. It's all fair and smooth, and please rivet me and I'll eat you last. And then you get to work and you give a gentleman a bit of a nip or a dig under his rivets, and then it's fire and smoke, and no apologies will meet the case." "Upon my word of honor as a dragon," said the other.
"I know you wouldn't do it on purpose, sir,"
said John. "But any gentleman will give a jump and a sniff if he's nipped, and one of your sniffs would be enough for me. Now, if you'd just let me fasten you up—" "It would be so undignified," objected the dragon. "We always fasten a horse up," said John, "and he's the noble animal." "That's all very well," said the dragon, "but how do I know you'd untie me again when you'd riveted me? Give me something in pledge. What do you value most?" "My hammer," said John. "A blacksmith is nothing without a hammer." "But you'd want that for riveting me. You must think of something else, and at once, or I'll eat you first." At this moment the baby in the room above began to scream. Its mother had been so quiet that it thought she had settled down for the night, and that it was time to begin. "Whatever is that?" said the dragon, starting so that every plate on his body rattled. "It's only the baby," said John. "What's that?" said the dragon. "Something you value?" "Well, yes, sir, rather," said the blacksmith. "Then bring it here," said the dragon, "and I'll take care of it till you've done riveting me, and you shall tie me up." "All right, sir," said John, "but I ought to warn you, babies are poison to dragons, so I don't deceive you. It's all right to touch, but don't you go putting it into your mouth. I shouldn't like to see any harm come to a nice-looking gentleman like you." The dragon purred at this compliment and said, "All right, I'll be careful. Now go and fetch the thing, whatever it is." So John ran up the steps as quickly as he could, for he knew that if the dragon got impatient before it was fastened, it could heave up the roof of the dungeon with one heave of its back and kill them all in the ruins. His wife was asleep in spite of the baby's cries, and John picked up the baby and took it down and put it between the dragon's front paws. "You just purr to it, sir," he said, "and it'll be good as gold." So the dragon purred, and his purring pleased the baby so much that it stopped crying. Then John rummaged among the heap of old iron and found there some heavy chains and a great collar that had been made in the days when men sang over their work and put their hearts into it, so that the things they made were strong enough to bear the weight of 1,000 years, let alone a dragon. John fastened the dragon up with the collar and the chains, and when he had padlocked them all on safely, he set to work to find out how many rivets would be needed. 6, 8, 10, 20, 40, said he. "I haven't half enough rivets in the shop. If you'll excuse me, sir, I'll step around to another forge and get a few dozen. I won't be a minute." And off he went, leaving the baby between the dragon's forepaws, laughing and crowing with pleasure at the very large purr of it. John ran as hard as he could into the town and found the mayor and corporation. "There's a dragon in my dungeon," he said. "I've chained him up. Now come and help to get my baby away." And he told them all about it. But they all happened to have engagements for that evening, so they praised John's cleverness and said they were quite content to leave the matter in his hands. "But what about my baby?" said John.
Well," said the mayor, "if anything should happen, you will always be able to remember that your baby perished in a good cause."
So John went home again and told his wife some of the tale.
"You've given the baby to the dragon?" she cried. "Oh, you unnatural parent!"
"Hush," said John, and he told her some more. "Now," he said, "I'm going down. After I've been down, you can go, and if you keep your head, the boy will be all right." So down went the blacksmith, and there was the dragon purring away with all his might to keep the baby quiet. "Hurry up, can't you?" he said. "I can't keep up this noise all night." "I'm very sorry, sir," said the blacksmith, "but all the shops are shut. The job must wait till the morning. And don't forget you've promised to take care of that baby. You'll find it a little wearing, I'm afraid. Good night, sir." The dragon had purred till he was quite out of breath, so now he stopped, and as soon as everything was quiet, the baby thought everyone must have settled for the night, and it was time to begin to scream. So it began. "Oh, dear," said the dragon. "This is awful." He patted the baby with his claw, but it screamed more than ever. "And I am so tired, too," said the dragon. "I did so hope I should have a good night." The baby went on screaming. "There'll be no peace for me after this," said the dragon. "It's enough to ruin one's nerves. Hush, then, diddums, then." And he tried to quiet the baby as if it had been a young dragon. But when he began to sing Hush-a-bye Dragon, the baby screamed more and more and more. "I can't keep it quiet," said the dragon. And then suddenly he saw a woman sitting on the steps. "Here, I say," said he, "do you know anything about babies?" "I do, a little," said the mother. "Then I wish you'd take this one and let me get some sleep," said the dragon, yawning. "You can bring it back in the morning before the blacksmith comes." So the mother picked up the baby and took it upstairs and told her husband, and they went to bed happy, for they had caught the dragon and saved the baby. And next day John went down and explained carefully to the dragon exactly how matters stood. And he got an iron gate with a grating to it and set it up at the foot of the steps, and the dragon mewed furiously for days and days, but when he found it was no good, he was quiet. So now John went to the mayor and said, "I've got the dragon, and I've saved the town." "Noble preserver," cried the mayor, "we will set up a subscription for you, and crown you in public with a laurel wreath." So the mayor put his name down for £5, and the corporation each gave 3, and other people gave their guineas and half crowns and crowns, and while the subscription was being made, the mayor ordered 3 poems at his own expense from the town poet to celebrate the occasion. The poems were very much more admired, especially by the mayor and corporation. The first poem dealt with the noble conduct of the mayor in arranging to have the dragon tied up. The second described the splendid assistance rendered by the corporation. And the third expressed the pride and joy of the poet in being permitted to sing such deeds, beside which the actions of St. George must appear quite commonplace to all with a feeling heart or a well-balanced brain. When the subscription was finished, there was £1,000, and a committee was formed to settle what should be done with it. A third of it went to pay for a banquet to the mayor and the corporation. Another third was spent in buying a gold collar with a dragon on it for the mayor, and gold medals with dragons on them for the corporation, and what was left went in committee expenses. So there was nothing for the blacksmith except the laurel wreath and the knowledge that it really was he who had saved the town. But after this, things went a little better with the blacksmith. To begin with, the baby did not cry so much as it had before. Then the rich lady who owned the goat was so touched by John's noble action that she ordered a complete set of shoes at 2 shillings 4 pence, and even made it up to 2 shillings 6 pence in grateful recognition of his public-spirited conduct. Then tourists used to come in breaks from quite a long way off and pay 2 pence each to go down the steps and peep through the iron grating at the rusty dragon in the dungeon, and it was 3 pence extra for each party if the blacksmith let off coloured fire to see it by, which, as the fire was extremely short, was 2 pence halfpenny clear profit every time. And the blacksmith's wife used to provide teas at 9 pence a head, and altogether things grew brighter week by week. The baby, named John after his father, and called Johnny for short, began presently to grow up. He was great friends with Tina, the daughter of the whitesmith, who lived nearly opposite. She was a dear little girl with yellow pigtails and blue eyes, and she was tired of hearing the story of how Johnny, when he was a baby, had been minded by a real dragon. The 2 children used to go together to peep through the iron grating at the dragon, and sometimes they would hear him mew piteously. And they would light a halfpenny's worth of coloured fire to look at him by, and they grew older and wiser. At last one day the mayor and the corporation, hunting the hare in their gold gowns, came screaming back to the town gates with the news that a lame, humpy giant as big as a tin church was coming over the marshes toward the town. "We're lost," said the mayor. "I'd give £1,000 to anyone who could keep that giant out of the town. I know what he eats by his teeth." No one seemed to know what to do. But Johnny and Tina were listening, and they looked at each other and ran off as fast as their boots would carry them. They ran through the forge and down the dungeon steps and knocked at the iron door. "Who's there?" said the dragon. "It's only us," said the children. and the dragon was so dull from having been alone for 10 years that he said, "Come in, dears." "You won't hurt us or breathe fire at us or anything?" asked Tina. And the dragon said, "Not for worlds." So they went in and talked to him and told him what the weather was like outside and what was in the papers, and at last Johnny said, "There's a lame giant in the town. He wants you." "Does he?" said the dragon, showing his teeth. "If only I were out of this." "If we let you loose, you might manage to run away before he could catch you." "Yes, I might," answered the dragon. "But then again, I mightn't." "Why, you'd never fight him," said Tina. "No," said the dragon. "I'm all for peace, I am. You let me out and you'll see." So the children loosed the dragon from the chains and the collar, and he broke down one end of the dungeon and went out, only pausing at the forge door to get the blacksmith to rivet his wing. He met the lame giant at the gate of the town, and the giant banged on the dragon with his club as if he were banging an iron foundry, and the dragon behaved like a smelting works, all fire and smoke. It was a fearful sight, and people watched it from a distance, falling off their legs with the shock of every bang, but always getting up to look again. At last the dragon won, and the giant sneaked away across the marshes, and the dragon, who was very tired, went home to sleep, announcing his intention of eating the town in the morning. He went back into his old dungeon because he was a stranger in the town and did not know of any other respectable lodging. Then Tina and Johnny went to the mayor and the corporation and said, "The giant is settled. Please give us the £1,000 reward." But the mayor said, "No, no, my boy. It is not you who have settled the giant. It is the dragon. I suppose you have chained him up again. When he comes to claim the reward, he shall have it." "He isn't chained up yet," said Johnny. "Shall I send him to claim the reward?" But the mayor said he need not trouble, and now he offered £1,000 to anyone who'd get the dragon chained up again. "I don't trust you," said Johnny. "Look how you treated my father when he chained up the dragon." But the people who were listening at the door interrupted and said that if Johnny could fasten up the dragon again, they would turn out the mayor and let Johnny be mayor in his place. For they had been dissatisfied with the mayor for some time and thought they would like a change. So Johnny said, "Done," and off he went, hand in hand with Tina, and they called on all their little friends and said, "Will you help us to save the town?" And all the children said, "Yes, of course we will. What fun!" "Well then," said Tina, "you must all bring your basins of bread and milk to the forge tomorrow at breakfast time." "And if ever I am mayor," said Johnny, "I will give a banquet, and you shall be invited, and will have nothing but sweet things from beginning to end." All the children promised, and next morning Tina and Johnny rolled their big washing tub down the winding stair. "What's that noise?" asked the dragon. "It's only a big giant breathing," said Tina. "He's gone by now." Then, when all the town children brought their bread and milk, Tina emptied it into the wash tub, and when the tub was full, Tina knocked at the iron door with the grating in it and said, "May we come in?" "Oh, yes," said the dragon. "It's very dull here." So they went in, and with the help of 9 other children, they lifted the washing tub in and set it down by the dragon. Then all the other children went away, and Tina and Johnny sat down and cried. "What's this?" said the dragon. "And what's the matter?" "This is bread and milk," said Johnny. "It's our breakfast, all of it." "Well," said the dragon, "I don't see what you want with breakfast. I'm going to eat everyone in the town as soon as I've rested a little." "Dear Mr. Dragon," said Tina, "I wish you wouldn't eat us. How would you like to be eaten yourself?" "Not at all," the dragon confessed. "But nobody will eat me." "I don't know," said Johnny. "There's a giant—" "I know. I fought with him and I licked him." "Yes, but there's another come now. The one you fought was only this one's little boy. This one is half as big again." "He's 7 times as big," said Tina. "No, 9 times," said Johnny. "He's bigger than the steeple."
Oh dear, said the dragon. I never expected this.
And the mayor has told him where you are, Tina went on, and he is coming to eat you as soon as he has sharpened his big knife. The mayor told him you were a wild dragon, but he said he didn't mind. He said he only ate wild dragons with bread sauce.
That's tiresome, said the dragon. And I suppose this sloppy stuff in the tub is the bread sauce?
The children said it was. Of course, they added, bread sauce is only served with wild dragons. Tame ones are served with applesauce and onion stuffing. What a pity you are not a tame one. He'd never look at you then, they said. Goodbye, poor dragon. We shall never see you again, and now you'll know what it's like to be eaten. And they began to cry again.
Well, but look here, said the dragon. Couldn't you pretend I was a tame dragon? Tell the giant that I'm just a poor little timid tame dragon that you kept for a pet.
He'd never believe it, said Johnny. If you were a tame dragon, we should keep you tied up, you know. We shouldn't like to risk losing such a dear, pretty pet. Then the dragon begged them to fasten him up at once, and they did so, with the collar and the chains that were made years ago, in the days when men sang over their work and made it strong enough to bear any strain. And then they went away and told the people what they had done, and Johnny was made mayor and had a glorious feast exactly as he has said he would, with nothing in it but sweet things. It began with Turkish delight and halfpenny buns, and went on with oranges, toffee, coconut ice, peppermints, jam puffs, raspberry noyeau, ice creams, and meringues, and ended with bull's eyes and gingerbread and acid drops. This was all very well for Johnny and Tina, but if you are kind children with feeling hearts, you will perhaps feel sorry for the poor deceived, deluded dragon, chained up in the dull dungeon with nothing to do but think over the shocking untruths that Johnny had told him. When he thought how he had been tricked, the poor captive dragon began to weep, and the large tears fell down over his rusty plates, and presently he began to feel faint, as people sometimes do when they've been crying, especially if they've not had anything to eat for 10 years or so. And then the poor creature dried his eyes and looked about him, and there he saw the tub of bread and milk. So he thought, if giants like this damp white stuff, perhaps I should like it too. And he tasted a little, and he liked it so much that he ate it all up. And the next time the tourists came, and Johnny let off the colored fire, the dragon said shyly, excuse my troubling you, but could you bring me a little more bread and milk? So Johnny arranged that people should go around with carts every day to collect the children's bread and milk for the dragon. The children were fed at the town's expense on whatever they liked, and they ate nothing but cake and buns and sweet things, and they said the poor dragon was very welcome to their bread and milk. Now, when Johnny had been mayor 10 years or so, he married Tina, and on their wedding morning they went to see the dragon. He had grown quite tame, and his rusty plates had fallen off in places, and underneath he was soft and furry to stroke, so now they stroked him. And he said, I don't know how I could have ever liked eating anything but bread and milk. I am a tame dragon now, aren't I? And when they said that yes, he was, the dragon said, I am so tame. Won't you undo me? And some people would have been afraid to trust him, but Johnny and Tina were so happy on their wedding day that they could not believe any harm of anyone in the world. So they loosened the chains, and the dragon said, Excuse me a moment, there are 1 or 2 little things I should like to fetch. And he moved off to those mysterious steps and went down them out of sight into the darkness. And as he moved, more and more of his rusty plates fell off. In a few minutes they heard him clinking up the steps. He brought something in his mouth. It was a bag of gold. It's no good to me, he said. Perhaps you might find it useful. So they thanked him very kindly. More where that came from, said he, and he fetched more and more and more until they told him to stop. So now they were rich, and so were their fathers and mothers. Indeed, everyone was rich, and there were no more poor people in the town. And they all got rich without working, which is very wrong, But the dragon had never been to school as you have, so he knew no better. And as the dragon came out of the dungeon, following Johnny and Tina into the bright golden blue of their wedding day, he blinked his eyes as a cat does in the sunshine, and he shook himself, and the last of his plates dropped off, and his wings with them, and he was just like a very, very extra-sized cat. And from that day he grew furrier and furrier, and he was the beginning of all cats. Nothing of the dragon remained except the claws, which all cats have still, as you can easily ascertain. And I hope you see now how important it is to feed your cat with bread and milk. If you were to let it have nothing to eat but mice and birds, it might grow larger and fiercer and scalier and tailier and get wings and turn into the beginning of dragons. And then there would be all the bother all over again.
Tonight's story is E. Nesbit's sweet and funny Book of Beasts. He happened to be building a palace when the news came, and he left all the bricks kicking about the floor for Nurse to clear up. But then the news was rather remarkable news. You see, there was a knock at the front door and voices talking downstairs, and Lionel thought it was the man come to see about the gas, which had not been allowed to be lighted since the day when Lionel made a swing by tying his skipping rope to the gas bracket. And then, quite suddenly, Nurse came in and said, "Master Lionel, dear, they've come to fetch you to go and be king." Then she made haste to change his smock and to wash his face and hands and brush his hair, and all the time she was doing it, Lionel kept wriggling and fidgeting and saying, "Oh, don't, Nurse," and "I'm sure my ears are quite clean," and "Never mind my hair, it's all right," and "That'll do." "You're going on as if you was going to be an eel instead of a king," said Nurse. The minute Nurse let go for a moment, Lionel bolted off without waiting for his clean handkerchief, and in the drawing-room there were two very grave-looking gentlemen in red robes with fur and gold coronets with velvet sticking up out of the middle like the cream in the very expensive jam tarts. They bowed low to Lionel, and the gravest one said, "Sire, your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, the king of this country, is dead, and now you have got to come and be king." "Yes, please, sir," said Lionel. "When does it begin?" "You will be crowned this afternoon," said the grave gentleman, who was not quite so grave-looking as the other. "Would you like me to bring Nurse, or what time would you like me to be fetched? And hadn't I better put on my velvet suit with the lace collar?" said Lionel, who had often been out to tea. "Your Nurse will be removed to the palace later on. No, never mind about changing your suit. The royal robes will cover all that up." The grave gentleman led the way to a coach with 8 white horses, which was drawn up in front of the house where Lionel lived. It was number 7, on the left-hand side of the street as you go up. Lionel ran upstairs at the last minute, and he kissed Nurse and said, "Thank you for washing me. I wish I'd let you do the other ear. No, there's no time now. Give me the hanky. Goodbye, Nurse." "Goodbye, ducky," said Nurse. "Be a good little king now, and say please and thank you, and remember to pass the cake to the little girls, and don't have more than 2 helps of anything." So, off went Lionel to be made a king. He had never expected to be a king any more than you have, so it was all quite new to him, so new that he never even thought of it. And as the coach went through the town, he had to bite his tongue to be quite sure it was real, because if his tongue was real, it showed he wasn't dreaming. Half an hour before, he had been building with bricks in the nursery, and now the streets were all fluttering with flags. Every window was crowded with people waving handkerchiefs and scattering flowers. There were scarlet soldiers everywhere along the pavements, and all the bells of all the churches were ringing like mad, and like a great song to the music of their ringing, he heard thousands of people shouting, "Long live Lionel! Long live our little king!" He was a little sorry at first that he had not put on his best clothes, but he soon forgot to think about that. If he had been a girl, he would very likely have been bothered about it the whole time. As they went along, the grave gentlemen, who were the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, explained the things which Lionel did not understand. "I thought we were a republic," said Lionel. "I'm sure there hasn't been a king for some time." "Sire, Your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather's death happened when my grandfather was a little boy," said the Prime Minister. "And since then your loyal people have been saving up to buy you a crown. So much a week, you know, according to people's means. 6 pence a week from those who have first-rate pocket money, down to a halfpenny a week from those who haven't so much. You know it's the rule that the crown must be paid for by the people."
"But hadn't my great-great, however much it is, grandfather a crown?"
"Yes, but he sent it to be tinned over for fear of vanity, and he had had all the jewels taken out and sold them to buy books. He was a strange man, a very good king he was, but he had his faults. He was fond of books. Almost with his last breath he sent the crown to be tinned, and he never lived to pay the tinsmith's bill." Here the Prime Minister wiped away a tear, and just then the carriage stopped, and Lionel was taken out of the carriage to be crowned. Being crowned is much more tiring work than you would suppose, and by the time it was over, and Lionel had worn the royal robes for an hour or two, and had had his hand kissed by everybody whose business it was to do it, he was quite worn out, and was very glad to get into the palace nursery. Nurse was there, and tea was ready. Seedy cake and plummy cake and jam and hot buttered toast and the prettiest china with red and gold and blue flowers on it and real tea and as many cups of it as you liked. After tea, Lionel said, "I think I should like a book. Will you get me one, Nurse?" "Bless the child," said Nurse. "You don't suppose you've lost the use of your legs with just being a king. Run along, do, and get your books yourself." So Lionel went down to the library. The Prime Minister and the Chancellor were there, and when Lionel came in they bowed very low, and were beginning to ask Lionel most politely what on earth he was coming bothering for now, when Lionel cried out, "Oh, what a world full of books! Are they yours?" "They are yours, your Majesty," answered the Chancellor. "They were the property of the late king, your great-great-great-great—" "Yes, I know," Lionel interrupted. "Well, I shall read them all. I love to read. I am so glad I learned to read." "If I might venture to advise your Majesty," said the Prime Minister, "I should not read these books. Your great-great-great—" "Yes," said Lionel quickly. "He was a very good king. Oh, yes, really, a very superior king in his way. But he was a little, strange." "Mad?" asked Lionel cheerfully. "No, no!" Both the gentlemen were sincerely shocked. "Not mad, but if I may express it so, he was, too clever by half, and I should not like a little king of mine to have anything to do with his books." Lionel looked puzzled. "The fact is," the Chancellor went on, twisting his red beard in an agitated way, "your great-great-great—" "Go on," said Lionel. "Was called a wizard." "But he wasn't." "Of course not. A most worthy king was your great-great—" "I see." "But I wouldn't touch his books." "Just this one," cried Lionel, laying his hands on the cover of a great brown book that lay on the study table. It had gold patterns on the brown leather, and gold clasps with turquoises and rubies on the twists of them, and gold corners so that the leather should not wear out too quickly. "I must look at this one," Lionel said, for on the back in big letters he read, "The Book of Beasts." The Chancellor said, "Don't be a silly little king." But Lionel had got the clasps undone, and he opened the first page, and there was a beautiful butterfly, all red and brown and yellow and blue, so beautifully painted that it looked as if it were alive. "There," said Lionel, "isn't that lovely? Why—" But as he spoke, the beautiful butterfly fluttered its many-colored wings on the yellow old page of the book and flew up and out of the window. "Well," said the Prime Minister, as soon as he could speak for the lump of wonder that had got into his throat and tried to choke him, "that's magic, that is." But before he had spoken, the king had turned the next page, and there was a shining bird, complete and beautiful in every blue feather of him. Under him was written, Blue Bird of Paradise, and while the king gazed enchanted at the charming picture, the blue bird fluttered his wings on the yellow page and spread them and flew out of the book. Then the Prime Minister snatched the book away from the king and shut it up on the blank page where the bird had been and put it on a very high shelf. And the Chancellor gave the king a good shaking and said, "You're a naughty, disobedient little king," and was very angry indeed. "I don't see that I've done any harm," said Lionel. He hated being shaken, as all boys do. He would much rather have been slapped. "No harm?" said the Chancellor. "Ah, but what do you know about it? That's the question. How do you know what might have been on the next page? A snake, or a worm, or a centipede, or a revolutionist, or something like that." "Well, I'm sorry if I've vexed you," said Lionel. "Come, let's kiss and be friends." So he kissed the Prime Minister, and they settled down for a nice quiet game of noughts and crosses while the Chancellor went to add up his accounts. But when Lionel was in bed, he could not sleep for thinking of the book. And when the full moon was shining with all her might and light, he got up and crept down to the library and climbed up and got the Book of Beasts. He took it outside to the terrace where the moonlight was as bright as day, and he opened the book and saw the empty pages with Butterfly and Blue Bird of Paradise underneath, and then he turned the next page. There was some sort of red thing sitting under a palm tree, and under it was written, Dragon. The dragon did not move, and the king shut up the book rather quickly and went back to bed. But the next day he wanted another look, so he took the book out into the garden, and when he undid the clasps with the rubies and turquoises, the book opened all by itself at the picture with dragon underneath, and the sun shone full on the page, and then, quite suddenly, a great red dragon came out of the book and spread vast scarlet wings and flew away across the garden to the far hills, and Lionel was left with the empty page before him, for the page was quite empty except for the green palm tree and the yellow desert and the little streaks of red where the paintbrush had gone outside the pencil outline of the red dragon. And then Lionel felt that he had indeed done it. He had not been king 24 hours, and already he had let loose a red dragon to worry his faithful subjects' lives out, and they had been saving up so long to buy him a crown and everything. Lionel began to cry. The Chancellor and the Prime Minister and the nurse all came running to see what was the matter. And when they saw the book, they understood, and the Chancellor said, "You naughty little king! Put him to bed, nurse, and let him think over what he's done." "Perhaps, my lord," said the Prime Minister, "we'd better first find out just exactly what he has done." Then Lionel, in floods of tears, said, "It's a red dragon, and it's gone flying away to the hills, and I'm so sorry, and oh, do forgive me." But the Prime Minister and the Chancellor had other things to think of than forgiving Lionel. They hurried off to consult the police and see what could be done. Everyone did what they could. They sat on committees and stood on guard and lay in wait for the dragon, but he stayed up in the hills, and there was nothing more to be done. The faithful nurse, meanwhile, did not neglect her duty. Perhaps she did more than anyone else, for she slapped the king and put him to bed without his tea, and when it got dark she would not give him a candle to read by. "You're a naughty little king," she said, "and nobody will love you." Next day the dragon was still quiet, although the more poetic of Lionel's subjects could see the redness of the dragon shining through the green trees quite plainly. So Lionel put on his crown and sat on his throne and said he wanted to make some laws. And I need hardly say that though the Prime Minister and the Chancellor and the nurse might have the very poorest opinion of Lionel's private judgment, and might even slap him and send him to bed, the minute he got on his throne and set his crown on his head, he became infallible, which means that everything he said was right and that he couldn't possibly make a mistake. So when he said, "There is to be a law forbidding people to open books in schools or elsewhere," he had the support of at least half of his subjects, and the other half, the grown-up half, pretended to think he was right. Then he made a law that everyone should always have enough to eat, and this pleased everyone except the ones who had always had too much. And when several other nice new laws were made and written down, he went home and made mud houses and was very happy. And he said to his nurse, "People will love me now that I made such a lot of pretty new laws for them." But the nurse said, "Don't count your chickens, my dear. You haven't seen the last of that dragon yet." Now, the next day was Saturday, and in the afternoon the dragon suddenly swooped down upon the common in all his hideous redness and carried off the soccer players, umpires, goalposts, ball, and all. Then the people were very angry indeed, and they said, "We might as well be a republic, after saving up all these years to get his crown and everything." And wise people shook their heads and foretold a decline in the national love of sport, and indeed soccer was not at all popular for some time afterward. Lionel did his best to be a good king during the week, and the people were beginning to forgive him for letting the dragon out of the book. "After all," they said, "soccer is a dangerous game, and perhaps it is wise to discourage it." Popular opinion held that the soccer players, being tough and hard, had disagreed with the dragon so much that he had gone away to some place where they play only cat's cradle and games that do not make you hard and tough. All the same, Parliament met on the Saturday afternoon, a convenient time, for most of the members would be free to attend, to consider the dragon. But unfortunately, the dragon, who had only been asleep, woke up because it was Saturday, and he considered the Parliament. And afterward there were not any members left, so they tried to make a new Parliament, but being a member of Parliament had somehow grown as unpopular as soccer playing, and no one would consent to be elected, so they had to do without a Parliament. When the next Saturday came around, everyone was a little nervous, but the red dragon was pretty quiet that day and only ate an orphanage. Lionel was very, very unhappy. He felt that it was his obedience that had brought this trouble on the Parliament and the orphanage and the soccer players, and he felt that it was his duty to try and do something. The question was, what? The blue bird that had come out of the book used to sing very nicely in the palace rose garden, and the butterfly was very tame and would perch on his shoulder when he walked among the tall lilies. So Lionel saw that all the creatures in the book of beasts could not be wicked like the dragon, and he thought, "Suppose I could get another beast out who would fight the dragon." So he took the book of beasts out into the rose garden, and he opened the page next to the one where the dragon had been, just a tiny bit to see what the name was. He could only see Cora, but he felt the middle of the page swelling up thick with the creature that was trying to come out, and it was only by putting the book down and sitting on it suddenly very hard that he managed to get it shut. Then he fastened the clasps with the rubies and turquoises in them and sent for the Chancellor, who had been ill since Saturday, and so had not been eaten with the rest of the Parliament, and he said, "What animal ends in Cora?" The Chancellor answered, "Well, the manticora, of course." "What's he like?" asked the king. "He is the sworn foe of dragons," said the Chancellor. "He drinks their blood. He is yellow, with the body of a lion and the face of a man. I wish we had a few manticora here now, but the last died hundreds of years ago. Worse luck." Then the king ran and opened the book at the page that had Cora on it, and there was the picture, Manticora, all yellow, with a lion's body and a man's face, just as the Chancellor had said. And under the picture was written, Manticora. In a few minutes the manticore came sleepily out of the book, rubbing its eyes with its hands and mewing piteously. It seemed very stupid, and when Lionel gave it a push and said, "Go along and fight the dragon, do," it put its tail between its legs and fairly ran away. It went and hid behind the town hall, and at night when the people were asleep it went around and ate all the pussycats in the town, and then it mewed more than ever. And on the Saturday morning, when people were a little timid about going out because the dragon had no regular hour for calling, the manticora went up and down the streets and drank all the milk that was left in the cans at the doors for people's teas, and then it ate the cans as well. And just when it had finished the very last little halfpenny worth, which was short measure because the milkman's nerves were quite upset, the red dragon came down the street looking for the manticora. It edged off when it saw him coming, for it was not at all the dragon-fighting kind, and, seeing no other door open, the poor hunted creature took refuge in the general post office, and there the dragon found it, trying to conceal itself amongst the 10 o'clock mail. The dragon fell on the manticore at once, and the mail was no defense. The mewings were heard all over the town. All the kitties and the milk the manticore had had seemed to have strengthened its mew wonderfully. Then there was a sad silence, and presently the people whose windows looked that way saw the dragon come walking down the steps of the general post office, spitting fire and smoke, together with tufts of manticore fur and fragments of the registered letters. Things were growing very serious. However popular the king might become during the week, the dragon was sure to do something on Saturday to upset the people's loyalty. The dragon was a perfect nuisance for the whole of Saturday, except during the hour of noon, and then he had to rest under a tree, or he would have caught fire from the heat of the sun. You see, he was very hot to begin with. At last came a Saturday when the dragon actually walked into the royal nursery and carried off the king's own pet rocking horse. Then the king cried for 6 days, and on the 7th he was so tired that he had to stop. He heard the bluebird singing among the roses and saw the butterfly fluttering among the lilies, and he said, "Nurse, wipe my face, please. I'm not going to cry any more." Nurse washed his face and told him not to be a silly little king. "Crying," said she, "never did anyone any good yet." "I don't know," said the little king. "I seem to see better and to hear better now that I've cried for a week. Now, nurse dear, I know I'm right. So kiss me in case I never come back. I must try to see if I can't save the people." "Well, if you must, you must," said nurse. "But don't tear your clothes or get your feet wet." So off he went. The bluebird sang more sweetly than ever, and the butterfly shone more brightly as Lionel once more carried the book of beasts out into the rose garden and opened it very quickly so that he might not be afraid and change his mind. The book fell open wide, almost in the middle, and there was, written at the bottom of the page, "Hippogriff," and before Lionel had time to see what the picture was, there was a fluttering of great wings and a stamping of hoofs and a sweet, soft, friendly neighing, and there came out of the book a beautiful white horse with a long, long white mane and long, long white tail, and he had great wings like a swan's wings and the softest, kindest eyes in the world, and he stood there among the roses. The hippogriff rubbed its silky, soft, milky white nose against the little king's shoulder, and the little king thought, "But for the wings you are very like my poor, dear, lost rocking horse." And the bluebird's song was very loud and sweet. Then suddenly the king saw, coming through the sky, the great, straggling, sprawling, wicked shape of the red dragon, and he knew at once what he must do. He caught up the book of beasts and jumped on the back of the gentle, beautiful hippogriff, and, leaning down, he whispered in the sharp white ear, "Fly, dear hippogriff, fly your very fastest to the pebbly waste." And when the dragon saw them start, he turned and flew after them, with his great wings flapping like the clouds at sunset, and the hippogriff's wide wings were snowy as clouds at moonrise. When the people in the town saw the dragon fly off after the hippogriff and the king, they all came out of their houses to look, and when they saw the two disappear, they made up their minds to the worst, and began to think what they would wear for court mourning. But the dragon could not catch the hippogriff. The red wings were bigger than the white ones, but they were not so strong, and so the white-winged horse flew away and away and away, with the dragon pursuing, till he reached the very middle of the pebbly waste. Now, the pebbly waste is just like the parts of the seaside where there is no sand, all round, loose, shifting stones, and there is no grass there, and no tree within 100 miles of it. Lionel jumped off the white horse's back in the very middle of the pebbly waste, and he hurriedly unclasped the book of beasts and laid it open on the pebbles. Then he clattered among the pebbles in his haste to get back onto his white horse, and he had just jumped on when up came the dragon. He was flying very feebly and looking around everywhere for a tree, for it was just on the stroke of 12, the sun was shining like a gold guinea in the blue sky, and there was not a tree for 100 miles. The white-winged horse flew round and round the dragon as he writhed on the dry pebbles. He was getting very hot. Indeed, parts of him even had begun to smoke. He knew that he must certainly catch fire in another minute unless he could get under a tree. He made a snatch with his red claws at the king and the hippogriff, but he was too feeble to catch them, and besides he didn't dare to overexert himself for fear he should get any hotter. It was then that he saw the book of beasts lying on the pebbles, open at the page with dragon written on the bottom. He looked, and he hesitated, and he looked again, and then with one last squirm of rage the dragon wriggled himself back into the picture and sat down under the palm tree, and the page was a little singed as he went in. As soon as Lionel saw that the dragon had really been obliged to go and sit under his own palm tree because it was the only tree there, he jumped off his horse and shut the book with a bang. "Oh, hurrah!" he cried. "Now we really have done it!" And he clasped the book very tightly with the turquoise and ruby clasps. "Oh, my precious hippogriff!" he cried. "You are the bravest, dearest, most beautiful—"
"Hush,"
whispered the hippogriff modestly. "Don't you see that we're not alone?" And indeed, there was quite a crowd round them on the pebbly waste. The Prime Minister and the Parliament and the soccer players and the orphanage and the manticore and the rocking horse, and indeed everyone who had been eaten by the dragon. You see, it was impossible for the dragon to take them into the book with him. It was a tight fit even for one dragon, so of course he had to leave them outside. They all got home somehow, and all lived happily ever after. When the king asked the manticore where he would like to live, he begged to be allowed to go back into the book. "I do not care for public life," he said. Of course he knew his way onto his own page, so there was no danger of his opening the book at the wrong page and letting out a dragon or anything. So he got back into his picture and has never come out since. That is why you will never see a manticore as long as you live, except in a picture book. And of course he left the kitties outside because there was no room for them in the book, and the milk cans too. Then the rocking horse begged to be allowed to go and live on the hippogriff's page of the book. "I should like," he said, "to live somewhere where dragons can't get at me." So the beautiful white-winged hippogriff showed him the way in, and there he stayed till the king had him taken out for his great-great-great-great-grandchildren to play with. As for the hippogriff, he accepted the position of the king's own rocking horse, a situation left vacant by the retirement of the wooden one. And the bluebird and the butterfly sing and flutter among the lilies and roses of the palace garden to this very day.